All right. Good morning, everyone. Today we're gonna so we're gonna go over the RPA a little bit, the new RPA. There is a lot of changes to this, so it's probably going to take multiple webinars to be able to kind of cover everything that's changed in the new RPA. So if you have questions, go ahead and throw them down into the chat. I'll try and take care of those. I am going to try and keep this, around like 45 minutes or so. Hopefully everybody can see me. It looks like my video is a little grainy, but other than that, I'm going to go ahead and get started with what the new RPA looks like. We're not going to go line by line on the RPA. What we're going to do is we're going to cover a couple key changes that have happened, and then we're going to talk about just kind of the grid. So you can go into your C.A.R user profile or whatever, and just in the search bar type in new RPA, and you'll be able to get a copy of this if you're looking for it. It's probably good to go ahead and start reviewing it, so that when you go to write an offer, you'll be somewhat familiar with it. So the reason I'm not going to go line by line is because, like, again, there's so much here. Really, it's just a lot of things have moved, but there is some fundamental changes that have happened. And so we're going to go over a few of those today. One of the first things we're going to notice with the new RPA is they've kind of moved all the contingencies and costs into one section. They're referring to it as the grid. So we're going to see that here on page 1. You can see we have purchase price and things like that, expiration of offer. So really, they've put all the terms and everything into one section, which I think once we get used to it is going to be a little more user-friendly for everyone. Instead of it being kind of sporadic throughout the contract, it's all going to be in this grid section here. So we have contingencies, possession, documents, fees, compliance, items that are included, excluded, allocation of costs. There's a few changes in there, which I actually kind of like. And then that's about it. It kind of goes into the contract after that. So not a lot of changes with that, but some of the major stuff is, your 14Bs and your section 12s and things like that, they have been moved. So it's going to take a little getting used to. When you go to write your first contract with this, I would give yourself some extra time to make sure you're going line by line when you're writing the contract. So I wouldn't, if you're doing this a lot, writing a lot of offers, you're busy. I know a lot of us just kind of blow through this thing because we know it so well, but I would give yourself probably an extra half hour and definitely go line by line to make sure you're not missing anything. With that said, I did put together a little presentation here to go through a couple of the changes that I want to talk about. Hopefully you guys can still see my screen after it comes up. All right. So some topics we're going to cover today. All of the purchase agreements that have been changed. We're not going to cover all of them, but I'm going to let you know which ones have been changed. New purchase addendums. Again, we're not getting into those today. I'm going to show you which ones have been changed. Revised and renamed forms, substantially revised forms. There's 58 additional revised forms out there. The as-is clause defined, reinspection fees, and government required remediation. So the state and local retrofit. So we'll go ahead and get started. So these are the new car purchase agreements that have been revised. So there is a new one. It's the AB SPA, so this is already built subdivision purchase agreement and joint escrow instructions. The other ones that have been modified or updated is basically every single other one of them. So the condominium conversion, commercial purchase agreement, new construction purchase agreement, the notice of default purchase agreement, the residential income purchase agreement, and the vacant land. So ones to particularly pay attention to when you're going to write a new offer. You know, we see a lot of VLPAs and the RPAs. So if you're doing residential income or the vacant land, again, you know, it's been changed. So give yourself a little extra time when you go to write those offers to make sure you know what the changes are, and so that you can go line by line to make sure you're not missing anything. New car purchase addendums. So the manufactured home purchase addendum, this is a new one. This is actually replacing the manufactured home purchase agreement. So there's not going to be a manufactured home purchase agreement any longer. It's just going to be an addendum to the RPA, the new RPA. The probate purchase agreement addendum. This one is also replacing the old probate purchase agreement. So this is going to be an addendum to the new RPA as well. Complete new construction purchase addendum. That's replacing an old addendum. So that's been revised and updated into a new one. And then they added in 2 new ones, stock cooperatives and Tennessee and Commons, which are referred to as TICs. Those have purchase addendums to the RPA. Revised and renamed forms. So these are, they've been renamed. So if you're going to go into your zip forms and you're looking for a form that you used to use and you can't find it, the name may have been changed, and these are the ones that have been changed. So we have the buyer intent to exchange, the seller intent to exchange, delivery of increased deposit. The lead-based paint is no longer the FLD, it's the LPD. So that's a big one if you're going to be looking for that one. Options and upgrades, tenant occupied property addendum. That's another one that does get used fairly often. So no longer the TIP, it's the TOPA. And the wildfire disaster advisory was the WDFA. Now it's the WFDA. So I don't know, but if you're using these forms, give yourself a little extra time to check the new ones out before you're writing your offer. Substantially revised forms. So we do use quite a few of these. These have had revisions to them. A lot of that is stemming because of the new RPA, and they're just kind of, you know, updating these forms. So the assignment of agreement, that one's fairly popular. That one's been substantially revised. Buyer counteroffer, cancellation of contract, California Consumer Privacy Act, contingency removal, that's a big one. Notice buyer to perform and seller to perform, receipt for reports, the residential lease after sale, request for repairs, the seller response to request for repairs, seller counteroffer, seller multiple counteroffer, and the SPQ. So there's some big ones here that have been revised. I highly suggest taking a few minutes to check these out, see what the revisions are, and then you know, again, go line by line, make sure you're not missing anything. I'm not going to go over all these, but there's 58 additional forms that have minor revisions to them. Check out the SWIPY over here, that gets used quite a bit. The wire fraud, no one really reads that, but it's important information. So there's a few in here that have had some minor revisions. Be sure to check those out. Avid, and the FVAC if you're doing FHA VA. So this comes up a lot, and we're going to touch on as is. It doesn't seem like it's a big deal, but it kind of is. So because we get, or at least I see a lot of counter offers and things like that say, this home is to be sold as is, so on and so forth. But if you've been in the business a while, or if you've read the purchase agreements, you'll know that all of them always have been as is contracts, at least in recent years. So all the most recent C.A.R purchase agreements state that the property is to be delivered as is in its present physical condition as of the date of acceptance. So what they've done now is they've actually defined as is instead of just kind of throwing it in the contract. They've given it a definition now. This exact language in the new RPA is found in 7B. And this new explanation / description of what as is means is narrowed down to as disclosed now. Missed that one. So this is a snippet of the new RPA. We're in 7B here. And it just says, as otherwise agreed, property shall be delivered as is, present physical condition, so on and so forth. It does give the definition of it now. So if you want to read through that a little bit, you can. The reason why I bring it up is because I see people writing that all the time. And when you write in a clause, something having to do with as is or something like that, you're changing the contract. And so we don't really want to do that. We want to keep the clauses that are in there. They're C.A.R approved. They've been reviewed by attorneys. So if you write in some sort of additional as is clause, you're actually modifying what attorneys have already approved in the contract. So you want to kind of stay away from that. There's no need to add an additional as is clause or line item to a counteroffer or addendum, as you would be changing the as is language in the contract. We all have those clients that are like, look, I want to make sure the buyer knows we're not making any repairs to this house whatsoever. So if you have that and you need to put something in there to kind of satisfy the seller, or if you want to put the buyer on some additional notice about the property being sold as is, what you're really saying is the seller's not making any repairs to this. We already know the property's being sold as is. So if you want to put something in a counteroffer like, buyer understands that the seller will not entertain any requests for repairs, replacements, modifications, corrections, and or certifications not already agreed to in the purchase agreement. That may be a better wording. You can also put stuff in the MLS in the agent-to-agent remarks and the confidential remarks, not in the public remarks. And if you want to put the buyer on notice or the buyer's agent on notice there saying, look, the seller is not going to be making any repairs. And then if you need to reiterate it for the sake of the seller, put something like this regarding the repairs and not stating that the home is sold as is, because you're not really given the full explanation at that point. And you're changing the clause in the contract already. So we're just going to talk about as is a little bit, because I do get a lot of questions that stem from the as is provision in the contract. So does the as is clause relieve the seller of obligation of having to make disclosures? The seller is always obligated to fill out any disclosures by law, regardless of as is. Even if you're writing in as is and you're not making repairs and all that other stuff, they're still required to make their disclosures. Some disclosures, such as a transfer disclosure statement, are not waivable by law. There's even a case which specifically held that an as-is addendum clause does not constitute a waiver of the TDS. So that's already been tried. Even where there are no mandated disclosures, the seller is obligated by law and all C.A.R contracts to disclose any material facts and defects that affect the value or desirability of the property. And this obligation is not negated by the as-is clause. So does it mean that the buyer has waived their contingencies for investigations? It does not. So the contingencies within the C.A.R purchase agreements, along with their cancellation rights and description of how they're removed, are spelled out in great detail. The mere statement that the property is sold as is no way constitutes a waiver of those contingencies. So just because the seller is saying we're not going to make repairs doesn't mean the buyer can't still do all their investigations. I always like to say that state of California wants the buyers to know everything that the sellers know about the house. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're going through and writing contracts. So does the as-is contract mean that the buyer has waived their right to investigation of the property? As-is clause only touches upon the condition of the property, does not speak to the buyer's right to investigate it. The seller wishes to limit the buyer's inspection rights or limit the inspection contingency. That should be clearly stated in the contract, and that's what you would put in your counteroffer. So what does the as-is provision accomplish, and how is it a benefit to the seller? The main function of the as-is provision is to relieve the seller of any obligation to pay for or make repairs with certain limited exceptions. The as-is clause benefits the seller as follows. Puts the buyers on notice that the seller is making no warranties about the quality or condition of the property. So it's sort of a red flag that the property is not perfect and should be carefully inspected by the buyer. It means that for resale property, any warranties must be expressed, and it relieves the seller from liability for defects in the property's condition of which the seller did not have knowledge and therefore could not disclose, and that were not concealed by fraud or misrepresentation. Does it relieve the seller from liability for active misrepresentations or knowingly failing to disclose? So the as-is provision doesn't relieve the seller from any liability for active misrepresentations or a failure to disclose material information about the property. So just because we're in a hot market right now and the seller, is wanting to sell as is, they're not going to make repairs, so on and so forth. This doesn't mean that they can't disclose things, and they still need to be as truthful as possible when filling out their disclosures, because a misrepresentation and knowingly failing to disclose is a big problem, and it can lead to some serious damages for them later on. Given the obligation for the seller in most transactions to fill the TDS and the contractual obligation to fill out the SPQ, or at very least fill out the exempt seller disclosure, the seller will generally end up disclosing all known material facts to the buyer. Does it eliminate any obligation on the part of the seller to make any repairs? So under the terms of the C.A.R contracts, the seller is still obligated to maintain the property in its condition as of the date of acceptance. The property is damaged during the escrow. As long as the buyer was not at fault for causing the damage, the seller will likely be obligated to repair it prior to close of escrow. So this will be the local retrofit requirements. This comes up a lot. This gets countered out. So we'll go into this a little bit for the new C.A.R contract. Is the seller also required to make repairs for state and local retrofit requirements? So this has changed a little bit in the new RPA. In most transactions, there will be state and sometimes local point of sale retrofit requirements, which may require repairs be made to property despite the as-is clause. For example, state law requires the seller in most transactions to certify that the water heater is braced and smoke detectors are properly installed. If these point of sale requirements are not complied with, then the repair work must typically be done prior to close of escrow. Places like that have these, if you're selling homes in the city of LA, like Long Beach has some down in the coastal area for garages. Up north, there's lots of stuff having to do with sewer laterals and things like that. So if you're in an area where there's state and local retrofit, be mindful of this and the changes. Seller may negotiate to shift the cost to the buyer and require the buyer to make or hire someone to make repairs if necessary. However, the conservative risk management approach is for the seller to make these repairs, since it is the seller who must certify compliance regardless of who actually performs the repairs. So smoke alarm, carbon monoxide devices, water heater bracing installation and improvements. So these are legally required installations and property improvements. Any required installation of smoke alarm or carbon monoxide devices or securing of water heaters shall be completed within the time specified in paragraph 3 and 4, which is now in the grid section. So here's a snippet of the new RPA, 3 and 4 down here. So the seller is going to be obligated to have these done within 7 days of acceptance, or another date if you change that. So if you're on the listing side, make sure you're paying attention to this. You know, when you're taking the listing agreement, or if you're doing your avid, you notice that these things are not taken care of. There's no CO2s, or the water heater's not braced. Get on that right away, because you don't want your seller to be in default by not completing those prior to 7 days. All right, so who pays for government required remediation? Just move this up. If the buyer is to pay for these items, the buyer, as instructed by escrow, shall deposit funds into escrow or directly to the vendor completing the repair or installation. Prior to close of escrow, seller shall deliver to the buyer written statements of compliance in accordance with any law, unless the seller is exempt. If the seller is to pay for these items and does not fulfill seller's obligation in the time specified, and buyer incurs costs to comply with lender requirements concerning those items, seller shall be responsible for buyer's costs. So what is the time frame for completion of government required repairs? So these are point of sale requirements. Point of sale inspection, reports, and repairs refer to any such actions required to be completed before or after close of escrow that are required in order to close under any law. Unless parties otherwise agree to another time period, any such repair shall be completed prior to final verification of property. If buyer agrees to pay for any portion of such repair, the buyer shall directly pay the vendor completing the repair, or provide escrow with an invoice, deposit sufficient funds to pay for the buyer's portion, and request escrow pay the vendor completing the repair. The buyer shall be provided within the time specified in 3 and 1, unless parties otherwise agree, a copy of any required government conducted or point of sale inspection report prepared to this agreement or in anticipation of the sale of the property. So here we have 3 and 1 within the grid, and the seller needs to deliver these within 7 days after acceptance. So again, if you're selling a property in an area that has these ordinances, I would take care of that ahead of time and get information going on that. What are seller obligations of reinspection fees if required? So this is a change. It's kind of a big one. If any repair in paragraph 10b1 is not completed within the time specified and the lender requires an additional inspection to be made, the seller shall be responsible for any corresponding reinspection fees. So if the buyer incurs costs to comply with lender requirements concerning those items, seller shall be responsible for those costs. So this is a change in the contract that needs to be made aware to the seller, especially if they're dragging their feet, getting items done on the home. It could now cost them reinspection fees. So can this be changed in a counteroffer? Yes, you can. So think about that. If you're representing the seller and you don't want them to be subject to any reinspection fees, then you need to put that in a counteroffer stating so. Otherwise, if an appraiser or somebody has to go back out there because something wasn't done at the first inspection, the seller could be liable for some reinspection fees. So that's a new one. So here we are in 10B. You can see government required and corrective remedial actions is now here. And then down in 10B3, it says reinspection fees. If any repair in paragraph 10B1 is not completed within the time specified and the lender requires an additional inspection fee, seller shall be responsible for corresponding reinspection fee. So this is in the new RPA. So take note of that for sure. So you don't want to have some angry sellers. All right, so that is actually all I'm going to cover today. I'm going to try and keep these somewhat short. Otherwise, it's just going to be too much information. Please, please, please be sure when you're writing your first contract on the new RPA that you're giving yourself some extra time to go through everything line by line, especially in the grid section. That's where there's a lot of changes. There's additions in there. Take special note of the grid section, what's been added, what's been moved, and just go take your time line by line. Make sure you're covering everything, checking every box that applies, changing dates because some of the dates have been changed. The normal contingency timelines, I think everything's down to 17 days now. So just kind of straight across the board. So take note of that kind of stuff so that you can make necessary changes if needed. And any addendums that you're going to be adding, like the SWIPy form or anything else, lead-based paint. For one, be sure you're adding it in to your offer, but for two, make sure you're reading through those first and going line by line on those as well so that you're not missing anything as you're writing these offers come December. So I've heard second week of December for the new rollout. That's actually a question that just came up. We have another question. So I've heard second week of December. I actually don't know. It seems like it's been flipped around a little bit. Anna Heath says she heard the 14th, so could be that. They may change it. I mean, this was supposed to come out at the beginning of the year, and they've just been making revisions and revisions. And that's why I've held off on this, because I think that this is the one they're going to stick with now. So hopefully any revisions they make are very, very minor. I would expect they're probably going to make something shortly after releasing this, just from feedback and stuff like that. So, but this is what we're going to roll out with. So get to know it, go into your car for your car account, and just in the search bar, like I said, search new RPA. This exact link comes up. I can send this link out with the replay as well. So you can just click from there. You will need to log into your car account to be able to view it though. One other question, if agents are taking the training through C.A.R, this RPA training is a credit towards your CE course. So that's good to know if you have CEs coming up. You can get some by just taking this contracts course. All the boards have these going on. So if you're a board member, check their training schedule. Most of them are doing these things weekly, or you can find a board or C.A.R or some sort of training. Escrow companies are putting them on. There's plenty of free trainings. I personally recommend doing multiples just to get different feedback and different opinions on it, on some of the new clauses that are in there. And all these trainers are going to say something a little different with the new contract. So attend at least one class. I'd recommend probably 2 or 3. We're going to do some more next week and the week after. We'll probably end up doing 3 of these, and that should keep from having too much information at one time, because like I said, this thing, it's completely different. And so we're only going to get better with repetition and going to multiple classes. So I guess that'll be it for about today. Dean says there's one, SDR has a in-class training if you're in the San Diego area. They didn't have any webinar offers at the moment. Check with your escrow rep though. They may be putting one on. I'm getting notifications weekly, almost daily of classes. So keep that in mind. This is coming up fast, but we're going to be going over some more here in the next upcoming weeks. We can talk about the grid a little bit more. We'll probably end up doing a sample offer if we can get to it. We may have to wait till it rolls out. And then we'll go over some other clauses because there are some other things in here that have changed. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight to the new RPA if you haven't seen it yet. Keep in mind those reinspection fees on your counter offers when that comes up, because that's going to be a big one too. So other than that, if there's no other questions, I'd say let's have a great week. Hopefully everybody had a great weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.